On the morning of my husband's funeral, the sky hung low and colorless, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath. I stood in our bedroom, smoothing the black fabric of a dress I had worn only once before, years ago, when grief was a distant rumor and not a weight in my chest. 42 years of marriage had taught me how to be quiet, how to endure, how to love without asking for applause. That morning, those lessons felt heavier than the dress. The church smelled of polished wood and lilies. People arrived in clusters, murmuring condolences that brushed past me like cold air. I nodded, thanked them, held myself together the way I always had. My husband's family gathered near the front pews, a tight circle of familiar faces that looked through me instead of at me. His sister avoided my eyes. His brother offered a stiff nod. No one asked where I would sit. When the usher approached, he leaned close and spoke softly, as if kindness could soften the message. He gestured toward the back rows. "They'd like you to sit there," he said, not meeting my gaze. For a moment, I didn't understand. Then I did. The front was reserved for blood, not vows, for names that matched, not lives that had been shared. I felt the heat rise in my face, the sting of something old and familiar. Humiliation doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly and waits.
I walked to the back without protest. I had learned long ago that making a scene only feeds those who expect you to disappear. From my seat, I watched his family fill the front rows, their shoulders squared, their grief public and orderly. I wondered how easily a life could be edited, reduced to a genealogy chart that forgot the woman who kept the house standing when storms came. As the service began, memories crowded in. The night shifts, the meals stretched thin, the years I carried us when his business faltered, the way he squeezed my hand when words failed, the promises we made when there was nothing to inherit but hope. I kept my eyes on the floor, breathing slowly, refusing to let tears become a spectacle. When the pastor finished, there was a pause, an unexpected clearing of the throat near the aisle. A man in a gray suit stepped forward, briefcase in hand. He introduced himself simply and asked for a moment of attention. I assumed he would speak to the family at the front. Instead, his eyes scanned the room, settled on the back, and stopped on me. "Mrs. Hale," he said clearly, "could you please come forward?" The room shifted. Chairs creaked, heads turned. I felt the weight lift just enough to stand. I rose slowly, heart steady, dignity intact, walking the long aisle alone, each step reclaiming space, each breath reminding me that silence can gather power, and truth has a way of finding light. As I walked toward the front, the whispers followed me like a tide pulling back from shore. I kept my eyes ahead, focused on the simple act of placing one foot in front of the other. I had spent decades mastering that skill, moving forward even when the ground beneath me felt unsteady. The lawyer waited patiently, his expression neutral, professional, as if this moment were long overdue. When I reached him, he nodded respectfully and offered his arm, not out of necessity, but courtesy. That small gesture steadied me more than he could have known. He addressed the room again, explaining that my husband had left specific instructions that part of his estate be addressed immediately, in my presence, before burial. A murmur rippled through the front rows. His sister stiffened. His brother leaned forward, confusion and irritation crossing his face. I stood beside the casket, hands folded, listening as the lawyer spoke of documents signed years earlier. Not hastily, not in secret, carefully, deliberately, over time. My husband had been thorough in ways his family never credited him for. He had known, I realized then, that love did not always protect against cruelty, and that silence sometimes needed reinforcement. The lawyer turned slightly toward me and asked if I wished to sit. I shook my head.
Standing felt important, necessary. He began to read, outlining how my husband had structured his affairs, ensuring that I would be protected, not merely provided for, but acknowledged. The words washed over me slowly, each sentence building on the last, reshaping the room. Faces in the front row shifted from impatience to disbelief. My husband's sister whispered sharply to her husband. His brother crossed his arms, jaw tight. The lawyer continued, unflinching. He explained that the house, the accounts, the investments accumulated over a lifetime of shared work belonged to me entirely. Not contested, not conditional, entirely. I felt no triumph, no urge to meet their stares, only a deep, grounding calm. This wasn't about winning, it was about being seen, about having the truth spoken aloud in a room where I had been pushed into the shadows moments before. The lawyer concluded by stating that my husband had requested I make any decisions regarding memorials, burial arrangements, and future distributions. The authority in his voice left no room for debate. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. I could hear my own breathing, steady and slow. The lawyer thanked the congregation and stepped back, leaving me alone at the front. For a moment, no one moved. Then the reality settled, not gently, but firmly. I turned to look at my husband's family. Their expressions had softened into something unreadable, a mix of shock and restraint. I gave them no speech, no accusation. I simply nodded once, a gesture of closure rather than concession, and returned to my seat. This time, no one suggested I sit in the back. The aisle felt shorter on the way down, the space less hostile. As I sat, I realized that humiliation loses its power when truth enters the room. The service resumed, but something fundamental had changed. They could no longer pretend I was incidental. The story they told themselves had been interrupted, and in that interruption, I felt my husband's presence more strongly than at any moment that day. After the service ended, people stood uncertainly, unsure of what the next step was now that the rhythm of the day had been disrupted. The familiar choreography of condolences and quiet exits had been replaced by something awkward and unresolved. My husband's family gathered in a tight knot near the front, their voices low, urgent. I stayed where I was for a moment, allowing myself to breathe, to feel the strange mix of grief and steadiness settle into my bones. When I finally rose, several people approached me, offering gentle words that felt more sincere than earlier. Perhaps seeing me called forward had reminded them that I was not a background figure in this story. I thanked them politely, my voice calm, measured. Grief had stripped away any desire to perform. I moved slowly toward the doors, the weight of the morning pressing down in a way that felt both heavy and clarifying. Outside, the air was cooler, clouds drifted low, and the parking lot buzzed with restrained activity. That was when my husband's sister stepped in front of me. Her smile was tight, her tone carefully neutral. She said there must have been a misunderstanding, that my husband would never have intended to exclude his family. She spoke quickly, as if speed might outrun the truth. I listened without interrupting, nodding once when she finished. I told her there was no misunderstanding, that everything had been done thoughtfully, over time. I said it quietly, without accusation. She frowned, then shifted tactics, suggesting we talk later, privately. I declined. Today was not for negotiation. Today was for honoring the man I loved, not rewriting his intentions to soothe others. As the hearse pulled away, I felt the finality of it sink in. This was not just the end of a life, but the end of a long imbalance I had carried quietly. In the days that followed, the calls began, some polite, some sharp. questions masked as concern, suggestions framed as fairness. I answered few of them. When I did, I was clear and brief. My husband had trusted me with his legacy. I intended to honor that trust without apology. At home, the house felt different, as if it had exhaled. I moved through the rooms slowly, touching familiar surfaces, remembering shared mornings and quiet evenings. I found notes he had left tucked into books, reminders of small joys, evidence of a life lived attentively. I understood then that his final act was not about control, but care. He had seen what others refused to see. Weeks passed. Tensions softened into distance. Some relationships faded, others recalibrated. I grieved deeply, but without regret. The humiliation of that morning no longer burned. It had transformed into something steadier, a reminder that dignity does not need permission. I began making decisions slowly, deliberately, guided by memory rather than pressure. I donated some things, kept others. I chose simplicity over spectacle, and in the quiet that followed, I found space to remember my husband, not as the man caught between loyalties, but as the one who, in the end, spoke clearly for us both. In the months that followed, grief settled into a quieter rhythm. It no longer knocked the breath from my lungs without warning, but it lingered in ordinary moments, in the empty chair across the table, in the habit of turning to speak to someone who was no longer there. I learned to carry it the way I had learned to carry so many things in my life, steadily and without complaint. The legal matters progressed as the lawyer had outlined, efficiently and without drama. Papers were signed, accounts transferred. Each step confirmed what had already been spoken aloud that day at the funeral. Still, my husband's family struggled to accept it. They reached out through indirect channels, cousins, old friends, people who thought they might soften me. I listened politely and declined to engage. There was nothing left to explain. One afternoon, his brother asked to meet. We sat across from each other at a small cafe, steam rising between us from untouched cups. He spoke about tradition, about expectations, about how things were usually done. I listened, recognizing the familiar language of entitlement disguised as concern. When he finished, I told him that tradition should never require someone to erase themselves, that marriage was not a footnote to blood, but a bond chosen and honored daily. He had no answer for that. I returned home lighter than I expected. Each conversation like that felt less like confrontation and more like confirmation. I was no longer defending myself. I was simply standing where I belonged. Friends noticed the change before I did. They said I seemed calmer, more present. I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for disapproval. I began to reintroduce myself to my own life. I joined a small community group, started walking in the mornings, allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined solely by obligation. Grief still came, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like proof that something real had existed, something worth honoring. Occasionally, I thought back to that moment in the church, the usher's quiet instruction, the walk to the back pew. I understood now that humiliation had been a test, one I had passed not by resisting it, but by enduring it until truth arrived. Silence, when chosen, can be powerful. It gathers weight. It waits. When the season turned, I visited my husband's grave alone. I brought no flowers, just myself. I told him about the small changes, the steady ones. I thanked him, not for what he left me, but for seeing me clearly enough to speak when he knew I might not. I promised him I would continue to live honestly, without shrinking. As I walked away, the air felt lighter. I knew there would always be those who remembered me as the woman sent to the back, but I would remember myself as the one who walked forward when her name was called, unafraid, carrying a lifetime of quiet strength into the light. Life slowly rearranged itself around the absence, not to replace it, but to make room for breathing again. I handled matters one by one, the practical alongside the emotional, learning that strength was not loud or sharp, but steady. Some days were harder than others, especially when memories surfaced without warning, yet even those moments passed if I let them. I discovered how much of my life had been shaped by accommodating others, smoothing edges, accepting less so peace could exist. With that awareness came a quiet resolve to choose myself more often, without guilt and without explanation. The inheritance was not a weapon, though many expected me to wield it as one, but a responsibility to honor intentions. I used it carefully, supporting causes my husband believed in, ensuring his kindness continued beyond his lifetime. That choice silenced much of the criticism, though whispers persisted in corners where accountability rarely visits. I learned to let whispers fade, recognizing that not every voice deserves space in my days. Time also shifted my relationship with forgiveness, teaching me it was not an obligation owed to others, but a gift to myself. Forgiving did not mean forgetting the humiliation or excusing it. It meant releasing the hold it once had on me. As seasons changed, so did my confidence, growing quietly from repeated acts of self-respect. I hosted small gatherings, filled my home with laughter again, and reclaimed spaces that once felt heavy. Life slowly rearranged itself around the absence, not to replace it, but to make room for breathing again. I handled matters one by one, the practical alongside the emotional, learning that strength was not loud or sharp, but steady. Some days were harder than others, especially when memories surfaced without warning, yet even those moments passed if I let them. I discovered how much of my life had been shaped by accommodating others, smoothing edges, accepting less so peace could exist. With that awareness came a quiet resolve to choose myself more often, without guilt and without explanation. The inheritance was not a weapon, though many expected me to wield it as one, but a responsibility to honor intentions. I used it carefully, supporting causes my husband believed in, ensuring his kindness continued beyond his lifetime. That choice silenced much of the criticism, though whispers persisted in corners where accountability rarely visits. I learned to let whispers fade, recognizing that not every voice deserves space in my days. Time also shifted my relationship with forgiveness, teaching me it was not an obligation owed to others, but a gift to myself. Forgiving did not mean forgetting the humiliation or excusing it. It meant releasing the hold it once had on me. As seasons changed, so did my confidence, growing quietly from repeated acts of self-respect. I hosted small gatherings, filled my home with laughter again, and reclaimed spaces that once felt heavy. Each step forward was modest, but together they formed a life that felt authentically mine. I understood then that dignity is not granted by seating arrangements or family titles, but by self-recognition. When people asked how I endured that day, I told them the truth. I listened, I waited, and I trusted myself. Endurance, I realized, is not passive. It is active patience aligned with certainty. That certainty now guides me, a steady compass pointing toward peace rather than approval. In choosing peace, I did not lose family. I gained clarity about who truly stands beside me. The rest became background noise, no longer capable of defining my worth. This chapter closed gently, without drama, leaving space for the next to begin. I moved forward carrying lessons instead of resentments, strength instead of fear, and in that balance, life felt possible again. Every morning reminded me that survival can transform into intention when we stop apologizing for existing. I no longer sit at the back of any room, literal or otherwise. If invited to diminish myself, I decline. If called forward, I answer.
That is the legacy I chose to keep. Not money, not property, but the courage to stand quietly in truth. It serves me well, even now, as I continue building a life rooted in respect. That respect begins within and radiates outward, shaping every choice I make. I am at peace with that. Finally, I allow myself to rest, knowing I earned this calm honestly. Nothing else needs to be proven. It is enough now, today.
Life continued to unfold with an unexpected steadiness, teaching me that grief does not vanish, but softens when met with purpose. Each responsibility I accepted became a quiet promise to myself that I would no longer shrink to keep others comfortable. I learned how quickly people adjust when they realize their control has limits, and how slowly respect returns once broken. The days after the reading were filled with polite distance, messages carefully worded, invitations suddenly cautious. I responded kindly but briefly, no longer explaining myself or translating my boundaries into apologies. That restraint unsettled them more than anger ever could have, because silence leaves nothing to argue against. In private moments, I reflected on the funeral itself, the way humiliation had been offered so casually. I understood now that cruelty often wears the mask of tradition, enforced by those afraid to lose status. My husband had seen through that fear long ago, which is why his choices were so deliberate. Honoring him meant continuing that clarity, even when it isolated me from familiar faces. I reorganized my routines, mornings beginning with walks and evenings reserved for reflection instead of television noise. These small changes rebuilt my sense of agency, reminding me that my life still belonged to me. When acquaintances hinted that I should reconcile quickly for appearance's sake, I smiled and changed the subject. Peace, I discovered, requires less negotiation than people assume, but far more honesty. I was no longer interested in being the acceptable version of myself for anyone else's comfort. As weeks passed, the sharp edges of grief dulled, replaced by a steady confidence I had not felt before. I realized that survival had quietly turned into authorship, and I was writing my own terms now. The inheritance mattered less each day, while the lesson it carried mattered more. Respect cannot be demanded from those unwilling to give it, but it can be modeled without apology. I modeled it first for myself, and that changed everything, quietly, permanently. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement and started investing my energy where it was returned with sincerity. The world responded differently once I did that, offering steadier connections and fewer performances. Even loneliness felt cleaner without resentment clinging to it like a shadow. I allowed myself to miss my husband openly, speaking his name without lowering my voice. Love, after all, does not end with death, only its physical habits do. Carrying that truth forward, I felt less broken and more complete than expected. The humiliation that once defined me became just another chapter, no longer the headline. I understood now that dignity grows when protected consistently, not when defended loudly once. With that understanding, I prepared myself for whatever conversations might still come. I would meet them calmly, or not at all, depending on what respect required. This was not revenge, but resolution, and it felt far more sustaining. I breathed easier knowing that my future was no longer negotiated at tables where I was unwelcome. Thereafter, the months that followed brought an unfamiliar kind of quiet, one that felt earned rather than imposed. I noticed how my body reacted differently to silence now, no longer tightening with anticipation of criticism. Instead, it offered space to think clearly, to remember without flinching. I spent time sorting through my husband's belongings, not with urgency, but with care, touching objects that held shared routines and small jokes only we understood. Each item carried a lesson about patience, about how love shows itself in ordinary consistency rather than grand gestures. I kept what mattered and released what didn't, discovering that letting go could be gentle instead of painful. Occasionally, messages arrived from his family, cautious and indirect, as if testing whether the ground beneath them was stable again. I responded when necessary, never cold, never eager, keeping my words factual and measured. That balance felt powerful in its simplicity. I no longer needed them to see me differently to validate my experience. Their discomfort was no longer my responsibility to resolve. Friends noticed the change in me before I did, commenting on a steadiness in my voice, a clarity in my decisions. I accepted their observations without deflecting, allowing myself to recognize growth without embarrassment. It became clear that grief had stripped away my tolerance for performative relationships, leaving only what felt honest. I invested time in volunteering at a local clinic, finding comfort in purposeful routines and familiar compassion. Helping others reminded me that my identity extended far beyond the roles others assigned me. It grounded me in the present, preventing my mind from replaying old scenes that no longer served me. On anniversaries and holidays, I created new rituals that honored my husband without centering loss. Lighting a candle, cooking his favorite meal, speaking aloud the gratitude I still carried. These acts transformed mourning into remembrance rather than regret. When I thought back to the funeral now, it felt distant, like a moment belonging to another version of myself. I understood that humiliation only retains power when it remains unexamined. Once named and released, it loses its grip. I stopped rehearsing arguments I would never have, stopped imagining apologies that might never come. Freedom arrived quietly when I released those expectations. Life continued, not as it was before, but as something more deliberate. I chose how to spend my energy, my time, my attention. I learned that respect begins internally and radiates outward, reshaping interactions without force. Even when loneliness appeared, it felt honest, unaccompanied by resentment or shame. I welcomed it as a signal to rest rather than a failure to fix. Gradually, joy returned in subtle ways, laughter shared with strangers, mornings filled with purpose instead of dread. I felt my husband's influence not as absence, but as guidance, reminding me to stand upright even when unseen. His legacy lived in my choices now, not in others' approval. That realization settled deeply, anchoring me against future storms. Whatever conversations still awaited me, I knew I would meet them without shrinking. I had learned the cost of silence born from fear and the strength of silence chosen with intention. This chapter of my life closed not with applause, but with peace, and that felt like the truest victory. As time moved forward, I found myself redefining what family meant, not through obligation, but through consistency and care. I began hosting small dinners, inviting people who had shown up for me without expecting anything in return. The table felt different now, lighter, filled with conversation that didn't require caution or self-editing. I realized how often I had once measured my worth by how much discomfort I could tolerate for the sake of harmony. That habit faded as I learned that peace does not require endurance of disrespect. I allowed laughter to return fully, without guilt, understanding that joy did not diminish the love I still carried for my husband. It honored it. When his relatives occasionally crossed my thoughts, I noticed the absence of anger. What remained was clarity. I could acknowledge their actions without reliving them. That distance felt like healing, not avoidance. I focused on building a future that reflected who I had become rather than who I had been expected to be. Practical matters followed naturally. I organized my finances with care, ensuring everything aligned with my long-term needs. That sense of security was not just monetary, but emotional, reinforcing my independence. I took short trips, something I had postponed for years, rediscovering curiosity and spontaneity. Traveling alone taught me that solitude could be expansive rather than lonely.
I met people briefly, exchanged stories, then moved on, enriched but unburdened. Each experience reinforced my trust in my own judgment. On quieter days, I returned to writing, journaling thoughts I had once swallowed. Putting words to experiences transformed them into lessons rather than wounds. I didn't write to accuse or defend, only to understand. In those pages, I traced patterns of self-neglect and resilience, seeing both with compassion. I forgave myself for the moments I stayed silent out of fear, recognizing that survival had shaped those choices. That self-forgiveness softened memories that once felt sharp. When anniversaries arrived, I felt prepared rather than blindsided. I honored them privately, acknowledging the passage of time without resisting it. Grief evolved into a quieter companion, no longer dominating my days. I learned that healing does not erase loss, it integrates it. Conversations with friends deepened, grounded in honesty rather than performance. I spoke openly about boundaries, about how grief can clarify priorities. Those discussions often resonated, revealing shared experiences others had never voiced. It reminded me how many people endure similar moments of dismissal and reclaim themselves quietly. I began mentoring younger women at the clinic, offering guidance without imposing conclusions. Listening to their struggles reinforced how universal the need for dignity truly is. I shared my story selectively, not as a warning, but as reassurance that recovery is possible without revenge. That distinction mattered to me. I had not sought to punish anyone, I had simply chosen myself. That choice continued to ripple outward, shaping decisions big and small. When I stood in front of the mirror now, I saw someone steadier, less reactive, more present. The future felt open again, not because everything was resolved, but because I trusted myself to handle what came next. I carried forward not bitterness, but discernment. The memory of being told to sit at the back no longer defined me. Instead, it marked the moment I stepped fully into my own authority, quietly, permanently. In the years that followed, I learned to recognize the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness felt like waiting for something that never arrived, while solitude felt like choosing myself without apology. That distinction reshaped how I approached every relationship. I no longer chased inclusion or approval. Instead, I observed how people showed up when nothing was required of them. Consistency became my measure, not promises or titles. I found comfort in routines that were entirely mine. Morning walks, quiet breakfasts, evenings spent reading without distraction. These moments grounded me in a sense of ownership over my life that I had never fully claimed before. When memories surfaced unexpectedly, they no longer knocked the breath from my chest. They arrived softly, like reminders rather than intrusions. I allowed them space, then let them pass. Healing, I realized, wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative, built from small, repeated acts of self-respect. Occasionally, I encountered members of my husband's family at community events. The interactions were brief and polite, stripped of tension but also intimacy. I didn't feel the urge to explain myself or revisit the past. Silence, once imposed on me, now felt like a choice, and in that choice, I felt free. I understood that reconciliation requires accountability on both sides, and without it, distance is not cruelty but wisdom. I invested more time in friendships that had weathered my grief without judgment. We celebrated milestones together, supported each other through setbacks, and shared laughter that felt restorative rather than forced. Those connections reminded me that family can be formed through intention as much as blood. I began teaching part-time at a local community center, sharing practical skills and stories with people navigating their own transitions. Watching others find confidence mirrored my own growth, reinforcing the value of patience and empathy. I didn't present myself as someone who had all the answers, only as someone who had learned to listen to herself. That humility kept me grounded.
On quiet nights, I sometimes spoke to my husband aloud, not out of longing, but gratitude. I thanked him for the years we shared and for the strength his absence had revealed in me. Love, I learned, doesn't end when someone leaves. It changes form, becoming memory, influence, and resolve. I carried that understanding forward, shaping how I approached new opportunities and challenges. When decisions felt difficult, I asked myself whether they aligned with the peace I had worked to cultivate. If they didn't, I declined without guilt. That clarity simplified my life in unexpected ways. I slept better, laughed more easily, and felt less compelled to justify my choices. The future no longer felt like something to fear or control. It felt like a landscape I could navigate with trust in my own judgment. I accepted uncertainty as part of being alive rather than a threat to stability. Looking back, I saw that the moment of humiliation had been a catalyst, not a conclusion. It forced me to confront truths I had avoided and to rebuild on firmer ground. I emerged not hardened but refined, with a deeper understanding of my worth. That knowledge stayed with me, steady and unshakable, guiding me forward with quiet confidence. With that newfound clarity, I began to reclaim spaces in my life I had once ceded to expectation. I redecorated parts of the house that had felt stifled under the weight of unspoken rules. Walls were painted in soft hues I loved, furniture arranged for comfort rather than display. Each small act reminded me that I no longer needed permission to exist fully in the life I had built alongside my husband. Friends noticed the shift immediately, how I carried myself, how my voice no longer wavered when I spoke, how decisions were made without hesitation. Even the local community, where my presence had once been quiet and unobtrusive, responded with warmth and respect. I realized that standing in my own authority did not require confrontation. It required consistency and patience. Invitations came differently now, not out of obligation, but from those who truly valued my presence. I accepted some, declined others, all with calm assurance. Occasionally, the distant voices of my husband's family surfaced. Questions, hints, or attempts at guidance arrived in letters or brief calls. I answered politely, never defensively, keeping my responses factual and brief. Their frustration no longer rattled me because I recognized it as a reflection of their expectations, not my worth. Each interaction reinforced my understanding that dignity cannot be demanded. It must be maintained quietly, steadily, and without apology. I began to mentor younger women at the community center, sharing not only practical skills, but also lessons in patience, self-respect, and quiet resilience. Their questions, their hesitations, and their small victories reminded me that my experiences, painful as they had been, could guide others toward clarity. This role became a source of fulfillment, reinforcing the sense that purpose can flourish even after grief. I also reconnected with long-lost friends, initiating conversations I had delayed out of fear of burdening them. These reunions were warm and easy, filled with laughter and shared memory rather than performance or expectation. I traveled short distances, exploring nearby towns and small retreats, enjoying the freedom of choice and the absence of anyone imposing judgment. Each journey reminded me that independence and serenity are inseparable once embraced fully. Through it all, I maintained rituals that honored my husband without succumbing to sorrow. Lighting a candle, tending a small garden, sharing a meal in his memory. These were simple acts that grounded me in continuity and love. I understood that grief transforms over time, and what remains is not weakness, but insight. My life, once overshadowed by external expectations, now glimmered with quiet authority and unspoken joy. I could sit in a room without shrinking, speak my mind without fear, and make choices without explanation. Each day reinforced the lesson that true strength comes from self-recognition, not the validation of others. The memory of being told to sit at the back became less a wound and more a marker of the moment I stepped fully into my own power. And in that understanding, I finally felt whole.